One of the best ways to really get grounded in the history of this region and to embrace complexity over simplicity is to do a little work to understand the terminology used. The story starts all the way back in 135 CE when the Romans wanted to punish the Jews living in this area for rebelling twice within a few decades. The Romans not only squashed the rebellion and killed a large number of Jews, they also took measures to decouple the Jewish people's connection to the land. First, they expelled the majority of Jews from this area. Second, they changed the name both of the province Judea and the city Jerusalem, its capital. Judea became known as Syria Palestina, named after the Philistines, the ancient archenemy of biblical Israel. And Jerusalem was named a generic Latin name in honor of the Roman gods and the current emperor. It's important not to superimpose today's politics back into the Roman period. There was not a group of Philistines vying for this land at the time. This was really about punishing Jews and finding ways to erase Jewish connection to the land. Finally, while after the first revolt against Rome, they destroyed the Jewish temple, after the second revolt, they went even further and erected a pagan temple where the Jewish temple once stood. I realize this is a lot of history, but it helps us understand why this strip of land came to be known as Palestine. The new Roman name of Syria Palestina eventually just becomes known as Palestine. And this small area of land is conquered again and again. And Palestine really becomes the name for the province in all of these different empires, including the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Crusaders, the Ottomans, and then the British. This takes us right up until 1948 when the British Mandate period ended. But all of this highlights that this area of land referred to as Palestine throughout all of these different conquests. And it also implies that there never really was a state or a distinct group of people who identified as Palestinian. That only occurs much later, and we'll talk about that. So when did the Palestinians emerge as their own ethnic identity group that had national aspirations for this land? This is a difficult question to answer in a simple or definitive way, and there's a lot of false information out there. So let's try to narrow it down a little bit. For most of the historical time period we're dealing with, let's say from the Muslim conquest in the 600s all the way through the beginning of the 20th century, the group of Arabs living in this land were really a loose mix of different tribes that practiced different religions or were part of different sects of Islam. While they may have lived under the control of the Egyptian Mamluks or the Turkish Ottomans, their main identity was more tribal or regionally based, and in certain cases, linguistic and culturally based, rather than seeing themselves as distinctively Palestinian. A simple example of this today might be to think about someone who lives in Philadelphia. They may identify as American and as a Philadelphian, but even though they live in the state of Pennsylvania, it might not be the real identity characteristic. They may never say, I'm Pennsylvanian, if that makes sense. Just as it would be inaccurate to refer to the Jews living in Palestine in 1500 or 1800 as Israelis, it's also misleading to refer to the Arabs living in this region as Palestinians during these earlier time periods. Rather, there is a transformation in the 20th century where the Jews in this land become Israelis and the Arabs become Palestinians. For the Jews, it's easy to point to the establishment of the State of Israel as the moment when the terminology changed. For the Arabs in this region, it's a little more difficult. At the risk of making this a little too simple, here's a short summary of the debate about these terms. In 1881, at the time of the birth of the modern political Zionist movement, Arabs is really the accurate word to use. In between World War I and World War II, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Arabs across the Middle East begin advocating for independence. Some Arab inhabitants of Palestine participated in this as well, first advocating for independence as part of Syria. Later, intellectual elites started advocating for independence and began referring to themselves as Palestinian. But even during the 1948-49 war, it would be difficult to claim definitively that there was a broad Palestinian identity. So at this point in time, the term Arab is still the most accurate term to use. By the 1950s, there was an increase in popular Palestinian national consciousness, And the formation of Fatah and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, in 1956 and 1964, respectively, highlight this fact. Even as these groups were forming, it's still hard to say that the average person living in this region fully saw themselves as Palestinian. That said, sometime between the 1960s and the first Intifada in the 1980s, that's when the change really happens. And between this period of time, there is a real widespread sense of Palestinian identity. I like to share this history because it feels so different from the set of political talking points that we often hear that make broad and simplistic generalizations about all Israelis and all Palestinians. What I'm sharing with you should feel more analytical and more curious than simple talking points. Don't get me wrong, advocacy has its place. We have to be able to fight for the things we believe in. And yet, there is something cathartic about spending time just being curious about the terms and the definitions and how they emerge over time. Now that we're talking about the origin of the terms, let's take a look at some of the numbers. There are roughly 2 million Arabs who are citizens of the State of Israel. For many decades, they were referred to as Israeli Arabs. But since the early 2000s, more and more of these citizens refer to themselves as Palestinian Israelis, as a way of expressing their sense of connection to the plight of other Palestinians living in the West Bank, Gaza, and other parts of the Middle East. Palestinian Israelis have full and equal rights under the law in Israel. They are members of Knesset, the Israeli parliament. They're able to be mayors and run for municipal governments in local Arab towns and villages. That said, Palestinian Israelis do face some forms of discrimination in Israel. For example, there are times when Israeli Jews are reluctant to hire Arab citizens. Arab villages tend to be poorer and less well developed than other Jewish neighborhoods. Arab Israelis, except for Druze and Bedouins, do not serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, and therefore they miss out on the certain veterans' benefits that come with army service. There isn't one reason for this discrimination, but much of it does emerge from the distrust that comes from decades of armed conflict between Jews and Arabs. In addition to Palestinians who live as citizens of Israel, there are some 3 million Palestinians living in the West Bank, the territory on the west side of the Jordan River that Israel captured from Jordan during the Six-Day War in 1967. The West Bank has a complicated governance structure. Overall, it is occupied by the Israeli military, but there are sections where there is more Palestinian autonomy under the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas. The West Bank is also home to about 500,000 Jews who are citizens of the State of Israel, but live in the West Bank. The Palestinians living in the West Bank are technically stateless. While many of them live under the control of the PA, Israel still controls things like water, electricity, and overall security. The area is dotted with checkpoints, and a security barrier was built in 2003 and 4 when terrorist groups were traveling from the West Bank and attacking civilians in Israel with suicide bombs. While Palestinians living in the West Bank generally have a lower standard of living than both Jews and Palestinians living in Israel proper, they have a much higher standard of living than the Palestinians living in Gaza. The Gaza Strip is located on the Mediterranean coast, sandwiched between Israel in the north and east and Egypt in the south. Gaza was controlled by Egypt until 1967, when it was conquered by Israel during the Six-Day War. Israel did attempt to return Gaza to Egypt as part of the 1979 peace deal, but Egypt refused for a myriad of reasons, ranging from the poverty of Gaza, which Egypt didn't want to inherit, to Egypt's hope that there would one day be a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza, even before this current war, was one of the poorest and most densely populated places in the world. Gaza is home to approximately 2 million Palestinians. There used to be some Jewish communities in Gaza, but they were dismantled when Israel withdrew from Gaza unilaterally in 2005. Similar to the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority was once in control of Gaza. That ended in 2007 when Hamas ousted them in a form of a military coup. It's important to know that Hamas is a terrorist group that in its charter calls for the destruction of Israel. And that charter is infused with a fundamentalist commitment to Islam. What this means practically is that Hamas imposes Islamic law in Gaza, and that means that there are restrictions on drinking alcohol and women's rights. This is much stricter than what we see in the West Bank. Except during moments of war, Hamas tends to not be overwhelmingly popular among Palestinians. And yet they are seen as the more trusted and less corrupt party when compared with the Palestinian Authority, which is run by the Fatah party. While the PA is considered more moderate both in terms of religion and its current views on terrorism, they are also seen as more corrupt because its leaders have gotten rich by misappropriating foreign aid, and they're often seen as collaborators with Israel when they partner on security. Hamas, on the other hand, often distrusted for their radical militarism and ultra-religious views, have been seen as doing something good for Palestinians over the past few years. Though their leaders have also accumulated billions of dollars in wealth, Hamas also invests some of that to build homes and schools and better roads. Now we also have to talk about the Palestinians of East Jerusalem and its greater vicinity. This is a different group altogether. The area in which they live was formally annexed by Israel after the 1967 war, and therefore they have a different status than Palestinians living in the West Bank or Gaza. In 1967, Israel offered these residents citizenship in Israel, just like Israel did to the Arabs living in Israel after 1949. But as a rejection of Israel's authority, this community's leaders refused the offer. As a result, Palestinians living in East Jerusalem hold an Israeli legal status known as resident of East Jerusalem. This status leaves them in a kind of political limbo. They're not really full citizens of Israel, but they're also not completely represented by the Palestinian Authority, which rules the West Bank. Now that we've gotten grounded in the origin of the term Palestine and Palestinian, and we've explored some of the different statuses in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, it's time to actually go back a little bit in history and to understand the birth of modern Zionism.